And welcome back to The Responsible Edge, the podcast exploring how to balance profit with purpose in a complex world. I'm Charlie Martin, your host, founder of TrueMark and the Anti-Greenwash Charter. And I'm delighted to say our article this week is, Does Planting Trees Really Help Cool the Planet? We'll be unpacking what trees can really do for the climate and what they can't. And I'm absolutely thrilled to say I've got a real expert on this today in Derek Emsley, co-founder and CEO of Tentree and Veritree, two ventures aiming to reuse tech and consumer power to scale global reforestation. Derek, it's an absolute delight to have you on the show. I know we've had a few false starts, but thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Charlie. Excited to be here.
Now, Derek, I'm sure our listeners and viewers are immediately diving onto LinkedIn to be like, what is Tentree? What is Veritree? It sounds intriguing. We're talking about trees today. Before they get there and before they start sort of, dragging their attention away from our conversation, can you just provide our listeners and viewers with a bit of a flavor as to, what your work entails, what you're trying to achieve, and giving us a bit more background?
Yeah, I guess, to summarize both the businesses, really our focus is on building a platform to really scale restoration all across the globe. And to the point you made earlier, we really have two businesses that allow us to do that. The first being Tentree, which is a consumer brand where for every product we sell, we fund reforestation all across the globe. We try to make the most sustainable outdoor lifestyle apparel. And then with the profits from every product, we fund reforestation. And to date, in the last 13 years, that business has funded over 100 million trees to be planted, tens of millions of dollars of reforestation all across the globe. And then more recently, about 4 or 5 years ago, we launched a platform called Veritree. This was a tool that we were building internally at Tentree to audit our own reforestation efforts. We were kind of constantly faced with this challenge of, A, did the tree get planted? B, did anybody else claim that same tree? C, did it survive, and was it even the right tree in the first place? And so we were faced with all these challenges, and so we started to build this tooling around solving that for Tentree. And we actually started getting approached by other businesses that were funding reforestation and asking those same questions. And so in 2022, we rolled Veritree out as a standalone platform to actually build the technology to power that restoration work all across the globe, make it verifiable, auditable, and transparent, and ensure that technology can, help solve some of these challenges that are constantly facing restoration work.
Derek, that was beautiful. I mean, you can tell that you're a founder here, because that was absolutely beautifully introduced, and I can tell that you've done that once or twice before. But I have to say, I love it when I hear from founders about developing new businesses that have come from their own internal need and ultimately allowed them then to roll that out, as you say, and deliver it to other, partners and suppliers, etc., that kind of have that need as well. It's a very organic way of developing a new business, which is great. I want to ask you though, how did we get here? Ultimately, you've done amazing things in this space already. But for those, I'm obviously going to link to your LinkedIn profile, so listeners and viewers can go and have a deep dive if you like. But I want to ask you a little bit more of a kind of a personal question, really, in terms of how we got here. What's ultimately inspired you to do what you've done in your career? What's led us to this point?
I mean, I think there's always the kind of founder journey story that sort of gives the perspective that A led to B, led to C, and it was this kind of, straight line towards where we are today. I think the reality is that's rarely actually the case, and it wasn't really for us. I grew up in the prairies here in Canada, in the world of kind of all the sort of resource-driven businesses that Canada is often known for: oil and gas, mining, potash, farming. And really, our first experience with tree planting came as a result of just seeing some of the, fear around the world of climate. And being kids early on, we wanted to create a solution, and the only thing we knew that took carbon out of the air was trees. And the only thing that we also knew we had a lot of in Saskatchewan was farmland. And so we came up with the idea of planting trees on farmland. But it wasn't because we had this incredible love of reforestation. It was really just because we were trying to solve this problem that so many people around us were facing and talking about. That business, which was back when I was 16 years old, we started, wasn't ultimately viable, but it kind of opened our eyes to the world of reforestation. And that's the piece that we fell in love with. We fell in love with the idea of taking a area that maybe at one time had trees and no longer did, and restoring it back to what it was. And we got connected with this global network of organizations that were using tree planting not just for carbon offsetting, but for things like job security, poverty alleviation, as well as biodiversity and all these other things. And so for us, we fell in love with the idea of restoring nature. And really every piece of our journey ever since then, whether it be 10 Tree, whether it be Veritree, has been in pursuit of that, in pursuit of kind of connecting people to their own individual ability to have an impact, and really anchoring that through trees and through nature.
I've got, Derek, again, you speak so beautifully on this. I've got two questions. You keep referring to we. Can you just provide us with some clarity about who else is on the ticket?
So I've been fortunate since we started this journey to have co-founders on the boat with me ever since day one. My first business that we started in high school, where we planted trees on farmland, that was with my brother. And then 10 Tree, which we started when we were coming out of university, started that with, again, my brother, but also David Luba, who is one of my co-founders, and Stephen, another one of my co-founders. And then Veritree, the same co-founders have come on board there too. So really, we've been fortunate that, and people often ask us, like, what's one of the biggest sort of keys to the success you've had since day one? It really has been just the team we've had since the early days.
I was going to say, I mean, that's amazing to have sort of, I mean, I'm telling you to suck eggs with this, but starting businesses is a highly stressful environment and utterly terrifying and wonderful at the same time, in the same breath. But to retain the same kind of team throughout those experiences is amazing testament to the way that you guys have worked with each other, and ultimately the way that you've sort of shown up for each other as a team. So I think that's a huge credit to you. One other question I got for you now, looking at sort of the length of your career to date, when you think about the 16-year-old, I'm going to say slightly idealistic Derek, who's there, planting trees on farmland, how is your optimism towards what you're doing changed, if any, over the course of your career? Like, how do you feel about what you do now compared to how you felt about it when you started?
Just as optimistic, and frankly, even more driven by the impact it can have. I think when I kind of look back at who I was then, and we were kind of going into it with, to use your words, this idealistic, approach, where in a lot of cases it was because we just didn't know any better. We thought, okay, why trees take carbon out of the air? We have a lot of kind of marginal farmland. Why don't we just plant trees on farmland? And when you look at a lot of the conversation around tree planting today, a lot of the issues come from people having the idea that we did as a kid, which is just take the land that doesn't have trees and put trees on it, and we've saved the planet. And so I think what we came to realize was that that when we were young, we had the idealism without the practical know-how. And today we have the practical know-how, but also we have the understanding of the actual global opportunity and impact that it can have. And frankly, we understand more the drivers behind that need. And I think that, to me, has just opened our eyes to both the opportunity and the need for this work, but also given us the toolkit to make sure that we're actually doing the right things along the journey. Because, the idealism early on maybe didn't lead to the right outcomes. today we're trying to make sure that that idealism remains, but we're actually delivering on those correct outcomes too.
I think it's a fascinating observation, but I also think one of my views would be that because we've all been that teenage kind of 1 + 1 = 2. Surely we can just simply apply this thinking, very simple thinking, and this is how things should be. But coupled with that is often a lot of energy and that enthusiasm that is needed in order to get you into whatever the career path is that you ultimately end up taking. So there is a space for that, dare I say it, slightly idealistic kind of view as a younger person. It's just what somebody like yourself has done with that experience. You've pointed it in a direction which has allowed you to get to a point of doubling down on an understanding and appreciation of the space, which is now being played out very fruitfully in terms of the impact that you're having. So, I mean, again, sorry, Derek, I'm throwing my 2 pennies worth into your journey and experience, but I think it is really interesting. Let's move forward now, if possible. Would you mind, for our listeners and viewers, just highlighting the title of the article that we're going to be discussing today, and then just providing a bit of a summary around the piece?
Absolutely. The article that we're going to chat about is called "Does Planting Trees Really Help Cool the Planet?" And I think the conversation we've already had kind of dovetails nicely into this, because this article, to me, kind of the name tees it up, but really the question is tree planting actually having any real impact? Or is it frankly kind of undermining the important work that needs to happen in other areas? Is it, a nice thought, but it's kind of a distraction from the other more pressing issues? And, for me, the article kind of goes through a number of different pieces. One being that, in a lot of cases, tree planting does have a lot of really incredible impact, but it also kind of contrasts that with the important fact that it can also have negative outcomes if not done correctly. When tree planting is not planted where trees are needed, when, frankly, the important sort of ecosystem, things like the right tree, right place, right time aren't taken into consideration. And then it also kind of talks about how, collectively, trees are a nice sort of symbol in the overall conversation around climate. So as a result, at times, trees can be used as a way to sort of distract from the more important things that we maybe need to be doing. So really, I think my takeaway, and sort of to summarize it, was that the article sort of frames the world of tree planting as, an important part of our toolkit within climate, with the important caveat that it's when done right. And I think that really was my takeaway from it.
You alluded to before, when you were talking about where you've got to in your career and how you look at now you've got that sort of perfect mix of sort of understanding and appreciation of the practicalities of how to do this well, coupled with this growing appreciation of the vastness of the opportunity at play. How does that understanding of the opportunity at play chime with what's in this article in terms of, yes, tree planting is a key part of the toolkit, but it's not the overall solution? Can you just provide us with a bit more clarity around how you see the opportunity for tree planting in the fight against climate change?
Yeah. I mean, first off, I never say it's we have the perfect balance, but we're trying and we're getting better every day.
Sorry, my words.
The way I think about climate as a whole, and I would also just preface all this by saying that climate is just one part of tree planting. And I think that's an important distinction, because oftentimes reforestation just gets lumped in with climate, and it kind of it's this myopic perspective that that's the only reason to do it, when in reality, that's such a small part of the reason restoration is critical. Even if you look at the overall funding that happens for restoration globally, less than 5% of it has anything to do with carbon. So really, we are talking about a segment of the conversation around nature. But if I just kind of go back to the article and talk about the climate conversation, because I think that is what we're referring to a little bit, I think about climate in a few ways. first and foremost, it comes down to, we believe that the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere is too high. It's leading to warming. We need to reduce that, both from the standpoint of how much we're putting into the air, and then we also need to reduce it by removing some. So one of the pieces of the article that I completely agree with is that when tree planting and frankly any sort of carbon removal conversation is used to distract from the need to still reduce the overall emissions that are taking place, that's a bad thing. And I think we can all with that. So first and foremost, and arguably one of the most critical things we can do is stop emitting as much and continue to produce more and more and more. And, that's through new technology, that's through electrification, that's through all these different things. But we also know that we're, in a lot of cases, still a carbon-based economy, a carbon-based society, and we will emit CO2. There are so many things that are woven into our fabric of life that use carbon, whether it be cement, steel, transportation, food production. These things don't happen overnight. We don't decarbonize these overnight. So we will still emit. How do we start to remove? We've emitted. And so when I think about nature and when I think about that overall removal conversation, nature can play a really critical part. There's different estimates of how big a part of it can play, ranging from anywhere from sort of 25% to 50%, and reforestation, tree planting as a segment of that component can play a pretty significant chunk. So when you talk about the total global sort of carbon removal conversation, the place that reforestation plays, it is not by any stretch 100% of that conversation. It's not even 50%. Frankly, it's not even 30%, but it is a significant percent, a double-digit percentage opportunity.
And Derek, let me ask you on that, because I think that's that's brilliantly transparent of you and really insightful, I think, for people listening in to understand from a removal perspective that it isn't the ultimate complete 100% solution, far from it. What are the other initiatives that make up the rest of the carbon removal sort of toolkit, if you like?
Yeah, so I would actually go one step above that and say that first off, I think when people think about carbon and the conversation, there's sort of two pieces of the puzzle. There's the avoidance and then the removal. And avoidance has kind of fallen out of favor recently and sort of fallen out of vote, particularly when you're talking about offsets and like corporate offsetting. The idea behind avoidance is, how can we use carbon as a way to incentivize people to stop doing bad things? And so that would be like, use carbon as a way to fund people to have an alternative to cutting down trees. That is still a really important piece of nature. And because, frankly, every tree we cut down is a negative to our overall carbon conversation. But on the removal side, which is really where a lot of the focus is in place today, because it's a lot more easy to understand. It's not just avoiding a ton of carbon in the air, it's actually taking one out. There's really kind of two kind of components that I see. There's the more technical or sort of technology-based carbon capture, and then there's the nature-based component. So within the technology, there's things like direct air capture, and there's a variety of other solutions. And then within the nature-based side of things, there's a number of other approaches. There's things like reforestation, there's things like agricultural approaches, more sort of regenerative agriculture, and a handful of others too.
Super useful. Okay, well, and again, for our listeners and viewers that want to sort of check that out in a bit more depth and detail, we might link to some other resources so they can sort of understand things better. And I want to pick up on one thing, Derek, you said about the important thing, and the article alludes to this, is not to allow reforestation to become like that almost sort of, accepted distraction away from carbon reduction. When it comes to Veritree, is there any degree of kind of work that you do or requirements that you place on the organizations that you work with to sort of show and prove that they are still committed to carbon reduction, as well as perhaps engaging with you in order to do some offsetting / reforestation work? Is that part of your makeup?
So we don't necessarily have a prescriptive approach to that, to say like we will do this, we won't do that. I think that's kind of overly prescriptive for where we just are as a business at our stage. We also just generally have a belief that a lot of the sort of historic approaches to, companies stepping into this space has been a lot more of kind of guilt driven and sort of like calling people out rather than pulling them in. And so for us in general, our belief system is more of a, pull people in approach rather than call them out. So I would say like that's kind of the starting point, like the first principles for how we think about the world of this. That said, we have said no to a ton of partnerships where we don't believe that the organization is interested in doing this for the right reasons. And so in those cases, if really we believe that the reforestation is a, almost a like, kind of look over here while I, do the bad thing over here, that's not a partnership that we're interested in. Because as well, the restoration work isn't a sort of one day event. It's a long-term period of work over a decade or more to really do the tree planting, ensure the survivability takes place, and ensure that frankly, the forest is on the right trajectory. So, for us, it's about finding long-term partnerships that really embed this in their belief system, their brand, whatever it might be, and really build a partnership together.
Do you require like long-term agreements to be in place with organizations that you work with? They literally have to commit to, long-term contracts with you in order to work with Veritree.
That's good. That's our ideal. I wouldn't say that we hit it every time, but I would say the vast majority of our partners that we work with today are multi-year partners, where anywhere from 3, 5, even beyond. And if we're not sort of expecting some minimum commitment over X number of years, then there has to be a reason that we're doing that partnership. And so it could be that the business is embedding it in a way that doesn't necessarily allow them to sort of commit to that sort of long-term minimum, but there's a very clear approach where this is a critical part of the kind of infrastructure within their ESG or CSR kind of approach. So, while our ideal would be everybody signs on for a 10-year agreement, that's, we're probably going to have a hard time getting off the tarmac, just even to start. And so for us, it's really just building a approach to these projects that allows us to operate within that flexibility.
I get you. It makes a lot of sense. And when you think about sort of the rest, the opportunity, you've already alluded to the opportunity that's at play for, reforestation and restoration, as you've described. Like, where do you see things going? I mean, you're obviously calling in from North America currently. We've obviously hear a lot over this side of the pond regarding, the sort of political circumstances within which a lot of North American feeling, attitude, action towards sustainability related initiatives sort of is sitting at the moment. And I think that is fueling a kind of a global, I don't want to call it ESG backlash, but that's the phrase that people use to reference it. How do you see things playing out over the next 3-5 years? Like what do you you mentioned that you're optimistic. Like, what does that optimism look like? What do you think we can achieve from a restoration perspective over the next 3 to 5 years?
So earlier we were talking about how tree planting is an important symbol, and as a result can kind of be used in a negative way as sort of it's something that gets used as a way to distract. I would also argue the flip of that, which is tree planting as a really critical symbol can also continue to be used as a kind of rallying cry behind the broader climate initiatives that need to take place. I was at Climate Week couple weeks back, and there was a paper that I'm not sure if it's been published yet, but that had done some research into American philosophy or perspective on climate. And the feedback was that basically 1/3 said we really need to do something about climate change. 1/3 were kind of, indifferent. 1/3 didn't believe we needed to do anything about it. And then there was also the conversation on nature, and people were asked, do they feel we need to be restoring nature and restoring natural places? 90% said yes.
90.
90. So I think in general, what we're seeing, we work with some of the largest Fortune 500 companies across the world. And I see a lot of companies continuing to do really important work, whether it be measuring their footprints, working to reduce their impact, or kind of considering how they approach their carbon strategy and climate strategy. Another big component of that is their nature-based strategy. And you're seeing a bigger and bigger kind of piece of the conversation orient towards that. I still see companies and frankly, people doing incredible things. At times, though, it just sort of feels like we're not maybe talking about it as much, which is maybe a part some of the kind of current political kind of conversation. My belief, though, is that nature not only is a critical part of our overall sort of toolkit around climate, but it can also be an incredibly powerful sort of symbol and rallying cry. The most important thing, and really kind of going back to the article that you kind of sent to me before this, is that if we don't do it right, it will never become that symbol, because it will, if nature and tree planting, which has this opportunity to be this powerful sort of rallying cry, ends up being undermined by either sort of it becoming false promises or this sort of, illusion of impact, then it won't ever drive that impact. So my belief is over the next few years, it's the time where we build. It's a time where the messiness that we're seeing in the climate space is the perfect time for new solutions to come about. And in that time, I really believe that we can, people are a bit more quiet about it. People will continue to build. People will continue to do good work. And over the next few years coming out of this, we're going to have some incredible results to show that will really be amazing wins in the overall climate conversation. Wind in the sails.
Wind in the sails, indeed, Derek. I love that kind of growth. Let me just pick up on, you mentioned there about there is that threat, if you like, to restoration and tree planting, that it is performative perhaps, and doesn't really necessarily ultimately have the kind of impact that you're describing that we hope to have. Is that sort of overall as a sort of a sector initiative? Have we got players at play that are perhaps behaving in a way where it is a bit of a greenwashing activity, and that ultimately the next few years is about the very best players, the players that are doing it with authenticity and integrity, sort of rising to the top? Is that where we are in the kind of reforestation, tree planting space?
I think that's any market in the early days. Any market starts with a lot of sort of promise and people piling in because, like us as kids early on, there's optimism and idealism and, hey, this could be like a quick fix. And then, as the market evolves, as rigor and transparency and integrity becomes critical, really like the people that weren't in it for the right reasons don't continue to persist. They don't stick around. And so, you talked about it, and in general, I think there's this sort of evolution that's happening in nature. And I like tree planting is just a part of it. I wouldn't even just categorize this as tree planting. This is the overall nature conversation. It's kind of that performative to transformative evolution that's taking place. Because again, tree planting, at its core, tree planting is an input in pursuit of an outcome. Outcome in the conversation we're kind of having is maybe climate, but it's also biodiversity, it's jobs, it's socioeconomic impact, it's all the other things that nature can create. But those are outcomes. tree planting as itself, if all we are doing is just putting sticks in the ground, that is performative. But if you're doing it in the right way, in pursuit of the outcomes, that really is where it becomes transformative. And no one gets it right every time. Nature is hard. And we are all trying things all the time. Different types of planting, different densities, different, ecosystems. Like every initiative is somewhat different, but it's learning quickly. It's continuing to grow. It's being transparent about the learnings along the way.
Derek, you're going to get your first here of the show that I hand out to the guests that I think nail particular points. And I love that. Somebody coined this phrase on a previous show, and I thought it was such a beautiful word to describe collectively where we are with, I'm going to call it not just talking about nature-based initiatives here, but just sustainability as a whole. And they used the term clumsy. And I think there's so much in that. Because I think there's so many people with great intentions working in this space, as you say, but we just have to be a bit more forgiving, I think, in many ways, to understand that we are going through a period of innovation and development and growth, and that actually there are going to be mistakes that are made along the way, and that's just going to be okay. That's going to be part of the process. And I love that notion of clumsy. Derek, it's been a brilliant conversation so far. I now want to conclude by seeing what you're going to do. I think you've already sort of waved a bit of a magic wand over the course of your career, but I want to know now what you would do with one. If you could change anything regarding the corporate world, the business world, what would you do with a magic wand?
I would embed nature in every dollar we spend. I think when you look at how take the financial infrastructure we all operate on. We have all collectively agreed that 1% to 3% of every dollar we spend is going to the financial rails of Visa and MasterCard and all these other things that exist today to make our life easier. If I could wave a magic wand, it would be to do that same for nature and really embed nature as infrastructure and a core component of every single dollar that we spend as consumers, as businesses, as a planet. That would be kind of my magic wand.
Derek, I think we've had it before, but you're not necessarily positioned in such an eloquent way as you have. I mean, a follow-up question and by the way, I think it's a no-brainer. It's a brilliant suggestion. How is that? Let's get a little bit more practical with the magic of what you've just described. How do you see that sort of initiative playing out? Like, would there need to be some sort of global regulation or consensus that would allow us to then create that? Or do you think this is something that we could start seeing, particular jurisdictions around the world adopt sort of independently of one another?
I mean, I think Europe does a pretty incredible job with leading in some of these areas, because you often see Canada, where I am, US, and a lot of these other countries as kind of laggards in some of this, where, we don't necessarily implement the type of regulations on, climate and sustainability the way Europe does. But what you often see is that the work that happens in Europe, because of so many multinational companies, it inevitably, whether it becomes law in Canada or not, becomes commonplace. Mm-hmm. You see that with things like, the greenwashing directive and some of these consumer protection acts that are taking place in Europe. Every US, every Canadian company is preparing for it. And so from my perspective, it doesn't have to be a global ratification that takes place all at once, because that's, frankly, never going to happen. I think it just requires a few groups to take some concerted effort that have the ability to really kind of butterfly effect it out into the rest of the world. And I think Europe's already doing some amazing things. I think it's, it's a rocky road and it's never a straight line, but, really some, concerted companies and jurisdictions that really set a precedent can have such a bigger impact far beyond that.
And we'll finish there with a hear, your second hear of the show. Derek, it's been an absolute joy to have you on the podcast this afternoon. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time and for sharing your insights with us. It was really interesting and certainly illuminating in all things nature and in particular reforestation. So thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Charlie. Really appreciate you having me.
And that is all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to Derek Elmsley for joining me on today's show. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the mark of trust for communications. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.